Hello, I'm Chris Hartwell, and welcome to The Heartbeat. Today we're going to be talking about episode 6 of season 6 of HBO's Game of Thrones. Join me, won't you? So, this week's episode of The Heartbeat happens to be a rather historic one, in that for the first time ever, I am actually not alone on it. Well, physically, yes, I am alone, but I am joined by the rather brilliant voice of Mr. Dylan Shuck. Dylan, thank you so much for being here. It's a great pleasure to have you on the show. I'm really looking forward to talking about this more one-on-one with someone, and I'm sure many of our listeners and viewers are aware of who you are, but for those that are not, can you just take a moment to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, and what you're up to these days?
Well, it's my voice that's brilliant, not me and myself, so I appreciate that. But, yeah, I do a couple podcasts. I do a podcast on The Walking Dead, The Leftovers, Better Call Saul, and one on Ash vs. Evil Dead. And then recently launched a new movie podcast called The Watch and Talk. So all year round you can find me on that, and that's The Watch and Talk. And Chris has joined us on our last episode to talk about X-Men Apocalypse, so everybody should check that out.
Awesome. Again, thank you so much for joining me, Dylan.
Thanks for having me.
It's going to be great. With all that said, let's go ahead and jump on in and talk about this week's episode titled Blood of My Blood, again directed by the brilliant Jack Bender and written by Mr. Bryan Cogman. Now, one of my favorite things to do with any television show, but especially a television show like Game of Thrones, where there are so many disparate story threads, is each week, episode to episode, try and figure out what is the mortar, so to speak, of that given episode. What is it about this episode? What theme? What idea? What is it that ties everything together? Because when a television show takes the time to kind of infuse that level of cohesion, there tends to be a bit more of a satisfying result at the end of it. When you get to the end of that 45 minutes, you feel like, okay, I've had my fill of this specific television show for this given week. And I really felt like this week on Game of Thrones, the unifying idea or theme really was seeing things from a different, if not more holistic perspective. From Bran's visions of the past, to Sam's time with his family, to Tommen's conversion to the faith, to
Arya.
Absolutely. To Arya's decision to quite literally become Mercy, to Dany's final truly epic speech to her Dothraki. Each of those storylines just giving the characters, the audience, or both a slightly different perspective on who they were, what they wanted, and why. But to jump straight off into the deep end, because that is essentially what this episode did, pretty much picking up exactly where last week's left off, quickly revealing, A, just how much Hodor was taken for granted as Miria really had to struggle to pull Bran's sledge, and B, just how much of an information dump Bran received from the Three-Eyed Raven last week after he told Bran that it was time for him to take on that epic mantle himself. And honestly, we probably could take the rest of the episode just to pick apart all the little things that we saw in Bran's warg state. But Dylan, was there anything in particular that stood out to you and all these numerous flashbacks into Westeros' history?
Well, that's the first time we saw the Mad King on the show.
Indeed it was. Ooh.
We saw several shots of the Mad King and him barking orders.
Right, as he kind of screams his infamous line, "Burn them all," right before Jaime earns his nickname, the Kingslayer, as he stabs him in the back. Also, and though the moment is brief, we also see a bloodied hand, which I have a strong hunch belongs to young Ned Stark.
We just have to see what's going on in that tower, because I have my speculations on what was going on in that tower. He needs to get back to that flashback as soon as possible.
Oh, absolutely. And to be clear, I haven't actually read anything one way or the other confirming what's actually happening in that tower, but I think a lot of us have come to assume that that is where Ned Stark at last finds his sister Lyanna and potentially a baby Jon Snow. Which I am convinced will be one of the big revelations at the end of this season that we're all building towards. Just that subsequent reveal to the audience and to Jon himself that he is in fact Lyanna's offspring.
You know, it's interesting also that we see what happens with Dany in this episode after seeing the flashbacks of the Mad King, because that's her father, and you know, she may even be going down that path that he's going. So I thought that that was an interesting transition.
Totally. And it was that transition for me that was the most exciting part of the flashbacks and what followed. Because in those flashbacks, we were really witnessing the birth of both ice and fire. Again, seeing the children of the Forest creating the first White Walker, the Night King transforming Craster's babies into whites, as well as his power to raise the dead. And then intercut with that, we saw images of Dany, her rebirth out of the flames, and Drogon flying over King's Landing, which let's go ahead and use that to segue to the last scene of the episode, that being between Dany and the Dothraki. Dylan, what was your kind of initial reaction to that big scene when Dany delivered that speech to the Dothraki?
I got some Mad King vibes from it.
Yep.
You know, it was a little psycho in a way. I think she went a little overboard. I don't even know if that was necessary.
Definitely. Though at the same time, it was pretty amazing that we got to see that speech delivered from the back of a dragon. Probably getting some of the most cinematic shots we've gotten in 6 seasons, which is really saying quite a bit. And also the scene kind of did for me and continue to demonstrate more than any other character currently on this show, Dany and her storyline really is kind of in fast forward. Seriously, the ending of episode 4 would have been a season finale in the past, past, her character having spent the entire season stuck in that temple, just having long-winded discussions with those widows. And then again, the end of this episode was totally finale material, where the season would have been her and her Dothraki just wandering around the desert looking for Drogon. But the main point I wanted to make, and the reason I wanted to segue from Bran's storyline into Dany's all the way at the end of the episode, and you, Dylan, have already started to hit on this, is just the fact that in those flashbacks, we were really starting to see the larger conflict at play, that being between ice and fire. And for a long time, ice has seemed like the absolute evil, the one which the righteous fire will one day overcome and vanquish. But I don't know about you, but after last week, where we learned exactly how the White Walkers were created, for me that was really kind of the first time where I thought, oh, these guys aren't objectively evil.
Yeah, they're not objectively evil, exactly. They're not technically evil, they're just another opposing force.
Right, and then this episode, being made to remember that Dany's lineage and the blood that runs through her veins is anything but pure, it just really muddies the waters in some interesting ways. And I just love seeing in such close proximity the Mad King screaming, "Burn them all!" And then Dany, not quite screaming, but certainly very passionately quoting her late husband, Khal Drogo, who himself was rather volatile and vicious. And you just gotta wonder, what kind of ruler will Dany ultimately become if she's not kept in check?
This is what a lot of people are speculating. The show is going toward a Jon Snow versus Daenerys culmination at the end of the show, especially because it's called A Song of Ice and Fire. Does that sound exciting? Or what if Dany becomes the ultimate villain of the show, which it very well could be?
I think that sounds pretty much amazing.
I know!
Which also makes me think just how important it is that at some point Jorah returns to Dany, because that man really has always acted as her conscience in some way.
Yeah.
And though we didn't see Dany's other advisor, Tyrion, in the flesh this week, over in Braavos, we did continue to see his impersonator, as well as that rather comedic group of actors continue to reenact what's happened on previous seasons.
Speaking of this play, not only was it great to see a recap of the first 4 seasons that we got recaps of, it's really interesting to see the interpretation of what happened to the people of Westeros. Because we did not get the actual true story in that play. What we got was the interpretation of the people around, right?
Right, and seeing that interpretation and the crowd's response to Dany's chief advisor really did make me think that when eventually she makes it to Westeros, she's gonna have her work cut out for and winning over public opinion. It's not gonna be this easy, oh yay, she's back, everyone celebrates and rallies behind her. And as per Arya and Braavos, I personally was so relieved and thankful that the writers are done playing the whole "is Arya still Arya" game, and simply came out and stated that she was not only someone who longed for revenge, but also someone who could recognize pain and anger in others, even her enemies, and feel some sort of connection with them. Just watching that slow shift on Arya's face as she went from enjoying Joffrey's death, something I'm sure she wished she had been there to witness, to realizing that he, like her father, brother, and mother, had family that he left behind, and that they too must surely have experienced pain and anger, it was just rather affecting. And that moment later where she's looking in the mirror right before poisoning the drink, it was just this very clear recognition of she wasn't faceless yet. She could still see herself. She could still see Arya in that mirror, and it wasn't too late to turn back. The great thing, though, about Arya's storyline this week is she did make another decision that she cannot turn back from. Now that Arya has chosen to embrace her full Stark self, her relationship with Jaqen H'ghar and his Assassin's Club will irreversibly change and will hopefully force her to grow and mature in exciting ways.
I'm glad that we're not going to see her training montages anymore, though. Good Lord.
Yeah, me too. At the same time, though, I really also hope that they make her, suffer appropriately for making that decision. Of course, not because I like suffering, but because, like you said, we spent almost a season and a half kind of just on these training montages, and I just don't want the only takeaway for Arya from Jaqen to be just some nifty assassin skills.
Yep.
But let's go ahead and segue onto the next storyline over to King's Landing and the real Cersei, and the ramifications of her son's change of allegiance. How about Tommen's conversion, and what did you think of Jaime's face-off against the High Sparrow?
I would say seeing Jaime like this is so awesome. When you think about it, how far we've come with Jaime. He was the number 1 villain of the show at first. He was the one that threw Bran out the window. He was the one that drew on Ned Stark. The first season, he was the villain of the show, and we've come a long way with him. So to see the face-off, what a great, intense moment. And the moment with Lady Olenna saying, she's beaten us, that's what's happened.
Right. If there's any doubt in the audience's mind as to what had just occurred, the High Sparrow won. And you could just see it on his face, too. Just that little smirk And I love the direction on the scene too. Just bravo once again to Jack Bender. Jaime entering so confidently with that gallop up the stairs, only to quite literally be upstaged by his own son walking out and supporting his enemy. Something that also made the scene just a little more compelling was actually some of the overt parallels between what was happening here and actual historic events. So for example, Tommen's alliance with the faith was actually quite similar to some of the kings of England, like Henry VIII, who really used the Catholic Church to strengthen their own rule. Unfortunately, kind of the linchpin for the High Sparrow's grand scheme being realistic and therefore being powerful was Margaery. And I didn't particularly buy her sudden conversion to the faith. I thought we got a great first step a couple episodes ago when the High Sparrow told her about his history, but that she would suddenly be willing to push Tommen to join the cause did seem a bit of a stretch. My hope still is, though, that this is all part of a larger play for her and her enduring desire to be the queen, and that she's actually using both Tommen and the High Sparrow just to get her brother Loras back. But speaking of children being pushed, pulled, and bullied around, let's go over to Sam and Gilly's storyline this week and their visit to the Tarleys' rather luxurious estate. For me, though, this week's Sam and Gilly's storyline was absolutely essential for me to continue to invest in him as a character. Now, to be clear, I have always loved myself some good Samwell Tarley. He has just always been such a needed dose of goodness and purity on a show that is anything but. With that said, though, seeing him on his own, specifically acting out of ignorance, that being Jon's now obsolete orders, did have me concerned that his storyline this season would kind of just be a waste of time. So to have a series of events that told me that this specific journey and this specific stop really was needed for that character was just great. First off, I thought it was actually extremely fitting that everything about that first scene where Sam met his mother and sister, the acting, the dialogue, the wardrobe, the production value, all of it felt almost like it was part of this heightened soap opera of a medieval show. It just told me precisely the kind of softness that had been a part of at least half of Sam's upbringing, the part that had given him his kind heart and gentle soul. And then to have that dinner where his father, in one scene, completely razed to the ground any growth that Sam had had over the last few seasons. And what all of that did for me was remind me that this was the battle that Sam needed to enter and exit victorious if he was to ever grow in a real significant way as a person. He could stab dozens of White Walkers with Dragon's Glass or save Gilly hundreds of times, but he'd ultimately remain a shivering, beaten pup if he couldn't stand up and stop believing all the things that his father had told him he was his whole life. So seeing Sam walk back into that room and tell Gilly, we belong together. All of us. It just told me that Sam's story can now move in a direction that is autonomous and really exciting.
I think perhaps even more important is that he had Gilly stand up for him.
Good point.
With all the times that he stood up for her, to have her stand up for him the way that she did, I think was really important for him to help him gain the confidence that he gained.
Definitely. And speaking of someone who really kind of came along and gave one of our characters a little boost of confidence, how about the return of Mr. Benjen Stark?
And we haven't seen him since the 3rd episode of the 1st season.
Right?
When he started cracking heads, I was like, that's Benjen Stark, that's Benjen Stark.
Yeah, I was right there with you. And it was just great that he came and seemed to know so much, sort of taking over a small portion anyways of the Three-Eyed Raven's role in Bran's life. I did want to say, I found it interesting that Benjen was still so adamant that Bran continue his Three-Eyed Raven training to be ready to face off against the Night King, when the previous incarnations face off against the Night King really only lasted a matter of seconds, with the Night King clearly being the victor. Unless, of course, the Night King wasn't the victor and the Three-Eyed Raven's death was supposed to be some sort of Obi-Wan-style sacrifice meant to transform him into something more powerful than the Night King could possibly imagine. I mean, the face in the side of the heart tree last episode did bear a striking resemblance to Max von Sydow, so perhaps after death his consciousness was passed into the very trees themselves?
To my understanding, those faces are carved by the Children of the Forest.
Ah. Gotcha. So maybe the Children of the Forest carved it in honor of the Three-Eyed Raven? That could definitely be cool. Also, I was going to say, in regards to the Bran and Meera storyline, I think my only complaints in having the White Walkers so very quickly catch up with them, and then having Benjen so very quickly save them, is one, it seemed to make Meera once again obsolete, at least delaying Leaf's prophecy that Bran needed her. But two, it really did in a way cheapen Hodor's sacrifice. Though, at the same time, I suppose his death did buy them about 20 minutes, whereas Boromir's death and the Lord of the Rings, the Fellowship of the Ring, really only bought Merry and Pippin probably 20 seconds. Anyhow, each week, Dylan, we take a Twitter question, and this week's question comes from Mr. William Helmuth, who asks, I'm excited/nervous that we might have a Brienne and Jaime reunion/showdown on GOT. What are your predictions?
It would be very dramatic for them to have to face off against each other.
I completely agree, and I just really hope they utilize the history that those two characters have had. They've saved one another so many times, so to have them meet on the battlefield and kind of be forced to choose sides is just, it's so juicy, and I think they can really make a lot from it. And also, when you have a massive battle like the one I'm sure we're going to get, we are inevitably going to have a lot of nameless extras that we've never seen before nor really care about. So to have in the center of that 2 characters in conflict that we really do care about will really just maximize that whole battle sequence. Those are our thoughts anyways on this week's episode of Game of Thrones. Thank you so much for joining us on this supersized, very historic episode of The Heartbeat. It's been awesome having Dylan on, so thank you so much, Dylan. And take a second now to let people know where they can find you online.
You can follow me on Twitter at Shuckster, that's SCHUCKSTR, and you can follow all my podcasts are pretty much linked over there. You can go to shuckster.com also, and they're all linked there too. SCHUCKSTR.
Perfect. And I will definitely leave a link for a lot of those below. Also, definitely hop on over to Twitter, guys, and continue to send in your Twitter questions each week, hashtagging them The Heartbeat, and I will do my very best to answer as many of them as I can right here on the show. Finally, please do subscribe. I'm going to continue to review films and television on this channel, and I would love you to stay up to date on all of those things. But for now, I'm Chris Hartwell.
And I'm Dylan Shuck.
This is The Heartbeat. Thank you for joining us.